Well, hi everybody. Thanks for joining us for Finding the True Cost of a Cocktail. My name is John deBary. I am the creator of a non-alcoholic line of drinks called Proto. I'm also the co-founder and board president of Restaurant Workers Community Foundation and the author of Drink What You Want. And in my what spare time I have, I also do some freelance writing. And the genesis of this panel actually came out of a piece that I wrote for Punch, which was published in January of this year. It feels like a million years ago, 6 months, but this is just, it was just early 2021. And the piece was called Finding the True Cost of a Cocktail. And it really explored in the context of kind of the peak pandemic mentality, what really goes into the drinks that we drink at bars every night, who gets paid, how these ingredients are selected, how they're costed out, what are some hidden costs that people don't normally think about. Because for me, the kind of urgency of writing the piece is that in order for even a pandemic aside, in order for us to kind of have a more equitable and sustainable industry, both from a environmental and human perspective, we really need to examine what goes into our pricing and the ingredients that we're using. So to write that piece, I spoke to a few different bar and hospitality professionals, and some of them are joined. Actually, all of them are joined today to kind of do a live version of the Punch article, as well as explore some things that maybe have definitely changed in the last 6 months. These issues that we've been facing as an industry have been decades, if not centuries, in motion. But this year particularly, I think we've seen huge amounts of change, both practically and kind of emotionally, from the way that we treat the industry and who gets paid what and who deserves to make a living, essentially. So I'm really excited to have everybody here. Thank you very much again for joining us, and thank you to my amazing panel. And I'm just going to go down my Brady Bunch list. And the first person up is Donny Clutterbuck. He and I met when he was working as a bartender at Booker and Dax, and is currently bartending at Cure in Rochester, New York, as well as the founder of the Pour Cost app. Next up is Pasha Morshed, who is the owner of Rosewater in Clear Lake, Texas. And then another, everyone's a dear friend, but AK and I used to work together at PDT, and she was the head bartender at PDT, as well as the general manager of Existing Conditions. And currently she is the North American ambassador of rum for Bacardi. And then last, but certainly not least, is Claire Sprouse, who is the owner of Hunky Dory in Brooklyn. So thank you all for joining us today. And I'm really excited to talk more about this thing that I know I think about all the time, and I'm not even an active bartender or bar manager or running any teams right now. So I really just wanted to kind of start by getting everyone's, the way that the article was structured is that I kind of broke down kind of a sample about what goes into the pricing, what's labor costs, what's pour costs, credit card fees, taxes, et cetera, et cetera. And so I think probably one of the biggest chunks in that cost is going to be the literal actual ingredients. And something I always kind of get mad about is when people compare the price of a cocktail at a bar with, say, 2 ounces of a product that you could go to a liquor store and maybe spend $20 for the bottle, and how people have this kind of distorted sense of value for their cocktails. And so I just wanted to hear it from the kind of experts themselves and kind of their different perspectives from their bar programs and how it kind of dictates the percentages of pour costs. So why don't I start with AK, who at the time when I interviewed you for this article, you were GMing at Existing Conditions, now closed. But yeah, why don't you talk a little bit about what goes on there and what you were doing?
Yeah, absolutely. Yes, so as John said, I was the head bartender at PDT for almost 6 years, and existing conditions is my first sort of like official management role. So when I was at PDT, it was interesting as the years sort of progressed, because I feel like when I first started, a lot of our cocktails, the sort of model would be base spirit, homemade ingredient, homemade, local ingredient. And as, towards my later years, as sort of the spirits industry boomed, like many more of our cocktails were ingredient focused, or I should say spirit or liqueur focused versus homemade ingredient focused. So the sort of models there sort of changed, because before we would have our bar back that assisted in the bar, but also did bar prep. And as the years progressed, we had less prep and more ingredients that we purchased. And that sort of affected how our menu cost changed. Because at PDT, we had one set price for cocktails. And the way it always sort of balanced out is you had your Benton's Old Fashioned or your Mezcal Mule, which were very cost effective. And those were the most popular drinks on the menu, which afforded us to have some other cocktails that maybe had cognac or some fancy fortified wines or fancy eau de vies that we could still sell for $16, even though the percentage was higher, because only us nerds would buy them. And then as I transitioned to existing conditions, working out with their costs, it was a hugely ingredient prep heavy menu. Almost every cocktail on the menu had to be either pre-batched or had some sort of clarified infusion syrup, something that involved. So we actually had one, and at the end of my tenure there, 2 dedicated prep people during the day. So the way, we kind of had to change the way we approached costing a cocktail wasn't just on ingredients, but essentially you had to factor in the fact that we had, a whole other position in there. So if you figure you have one person, we're paying them $20 to $25 an hour, 40 hours a week just doing prep, that's an additional $1,000 a week that you have to include into the cost of just producing that cocktail. So it wasn't just the ingredients that went in, it was the time and the labor. I'm sure we'll talk more about labor costs coming up, but that was the way I kind of figured you had to factor that in, because it was a set cost in creating the cocktails. And what that sort of translated to during service is many of our drinks were easy to execute. All the carbonated drinks, we just had to, fluff them, carbonate them, and then they went out. So you had to kind of see, all right, well, how much could I, how much more can I sell by having everything pre-batched versus, the cost that it takes to pre-batch them. And so, it was, I was there for about 6 months before they closed. But that was like a really interesting concept. And I think over the past winter, I was doing some work with Dante, and it was a similar sort of model, because I was helping them with their partnership locations. So not working in the restaurants, but other locations where we were just selling bottled cocktails. So the cost, when we presented it to the venue, they're like, wow, these, costs are huge, but it was like there was no labor that went into them aside from the prep. So I don't know if that's like a base for the way that we sort of went about costing, but it's, it's just like a big sort of puzzle on how to figure out what's the most efficient and effective way to an equitable way to create a cocktail, and how much does that actually cost?
Great, thanks. I'm actually, your observation about, I worked at PDT, I think you may have worked a little bit longer than I have, but I also worked there for kind of literally forever. And I don't know if I ever put the pieces together in terms of moving from the kind of more prep and kind of local green market sort of ingredients to being more like bottled, ingredients like liqueurs and spirits and stuff like that. And so do you think that was more of like just a trend that kind of happened, or was there like a sort of intentional effort to make that change in the menu?
I think, I'm not sure. I mean, I guess I would say it was mostly organic, but, like if you had to describe like what's a PDT cocktail, the answer was always it has one sort of twist or ingredient that's unique to that bar. So maybe, so I think when I started there and probably when you were finishing up, it was, okay, this green market ingredient or this spice that we get at SOS Chefs or something like that. And then, again, as there were more sort of bottled options available, it would be, oh, well, we bought out all of this organic mead from upstate New York. And so we're like the only bar that you can really find this Floralia mead. And so the cocktail would be, the only homemade ingredient would be like honey, but it'd be like gin, this mead and honey and rosemary or something,
I think I remember that drink actually.
Yeah. So it was, we tried to find things in terms of modifiers that were, if not limited purchase, something that, again, if people are waiting 3 hours for a cocktail, they would come in and still feel like that cocktail was special. And I think just as more of those types of ingredients became available for purchase, again, as the spirits industry is expanded, we just kind of naturally lent more towards that.
Thanks. So Claire, I actually now want to turn to you because when I was interviewing you, two things stuck out in your program specifically. One was the desire to reduce waste and to reuse kitchen ingredients that may otherwise have just been discarded or composted, as well as also the challenge of running a gratuity-free, is that the term you use, establishment, and how that factors into like what your core costs, like your percentages are, and like, how you think about ingredients.
Sure. Thank you. So I'll first state that my bar restaurant is 2.5 years old. Within this past 2.5 years, I feel like I've reopened a new restaurant, a new bar, like 4 different times. So some of these things have shifted, but I will say the one thing that is constant, because it's been a constant in my life, is this underlying mission of sustainability. And that shows up in different ways for myself and in our venue. We do a lot in terms of water conservation. So we use a really water efficient ice program, which actually helps lower our bills. And we try to instill other SOP standards that help ultimately, when you're saving electricity, energy, gas, you're saving on those utility bills. So all of those little things are things that kind of factor into our overall survival. But for in terms of how that plays out into a cocktail and the cost of a cocktail, when I think about food waste, I heard somebody much smarter than me say once that food waste is just wasted flavors and wasted opportunities to learn. And I'll double down on that and say that it's also wasted money. Ultimately, when we're cross-utilizing ingredients from our kitchen into our bar program, or vice versa, or even just in like a more circular closed loop way in our bar, that is ultimately free money that we have at our disposal. And so we are able to turn something like cucumber seeds from the pickles that go in our chicken sandwich, we turn that into a puree, and then we have a cucumber cocktail. And so those are all like little cheats that we use to help lower our cost. And that, that even sometimes manifests itself in, working with, now we have our coffee program back up and running, but before utilizing coffee grounds from the coffee shop nearby and things like that. And I've consulted and done pop-ups where we're using leftover steamed milk from a barista station to make a clarified milk punch, things like that, which is really interesting. And so all those little things, it's not just when I talk about sustainability in our bar or when I'm teaching it elsewhere, I know that I'm effectively tugging at the heartstrings and people's, own moral agenda. But I think when people really start perking up in the bar world, I start talking about how it like helps with the purse strings and how it can positively impact your wallet. And when we're all operating on such small margins, those are so important. For Hunky Dory, I took it upon myself to make things even harder in the middle of a pandemic by going gratuity free. And we did that with the main mission of making steps towards or using equal pay as a steps towards equity, not necessarily the checking that box, but as a way to make steps towards the idea of what equity could look like in our industry. And so that also means that we have additional labor within that, within our costs. So that's something that we definitely have to think about. But I think a lot like AK's programs that she was just talking about, we tend to be a little bit prep heavy these days, and I think we always have, so that when people are in service, we are able to run a little bit slimmer and we're able to get drinks in people's hands faster. So we have to, make sure that whatever that prep is and whatever that food waste is being utilized, that it's not putting too much of a strain on our costs overall. So I don't want people, sifting through coffee grounds for 3 hours just to say that we're using some, like food waste, or, it all has to make sense on paper too. So those are all things that we think about. And for me, it's hard to say that like X amount of a cocktail is always going to be this amount in labor, especially when you're running such high labor costs as I am, because it's because we pay all of our employees more. So it means that we have to be if we have bad sales one week, it puts us in a more precarious situation, more dire situation. So that means that we have to be extra good on everything else. And so I think a lot about that in our cocktails and how we, I think in that article that you wrote, we were probably on the lower end of the cocktail cost. And we do that because it helps create an extra barrier to insulate ourselves from, the ups and downs of this industry and the ups and downs of taking on more accountability in terms of how we pay our staff. So we tend to run lower costs, but I also benefit, like that also stems all the way from my first bartending job where we had like daily cost meetings. And so, and I was terrorized by an accountant in an office somewhere far, far, far away. So I've always it's hard for me to take that lens off of making a cocktail. And I think that's helped me through my career ultimately, even though it's the least fun part of this, but it is, where it can't all be like fun syrup making and things like that. We're all trying to make sure our lives and our businesses are sustainable too. So these are important conversations to have, and I'm happy to be here and share.
Thanks. The daily cost meeting sounds kind of traumatic, honestly. But actually, it leads me to something I want to kind of get a quick poll on people. So when I was the bar director for Momofuku for many years, and when we costed individual cocktails, we really had a goal to do around 15 to 17%. And then in the Punch article, my sort of sample math landed at around 17% for the total cost of the ingredients, wholesale. That ultimately makes up the menu price. Maybe Pasha, what is that? Is that real for you? How is that different? Is that ringing?
We target a place about like average 20, but it's a shifting goal. So we change our menu a lot. We are in a just to give a little bit of background real quick. We're on the edge of the Houston city limits, right next to a suburb down near the Johnson Space Center. And there's not the cocktail scene in Houston in the center of the city kind of emerged roughly 10 years ago and then we are kind of on the bleeding edge. And so we have a very curious group of like our neighborhood is, they're very curious about cocktails, but they're also not prepared to see, you know, a $15, $16 drink on the menu, even though it might be justified. And what they're more interested in for us is the novelty of a lot of these cocktails. And so we try to have a very dynamic menu that changes on our whims, whether or not we're bored. I also try to make sure the environment is very stimulating for everybody that works there. So everybody feels like they have something they can contribute whenever. And all that said is because our general target is 20%, but you know, 1 month it might be 25, 1 month it might be a little bit lower. We do have, as somebody mentioned earlier, you know, we have a couple targeted loss leaders always, so that industry nerds come in and they can find something random and cool and fun. But then, you know, we do our best to get a couple 13, 12% poor cost drinks on there for the people who are coming in and just want something with vodka and fruit, and that's it. And they help subsidize the interesting stuff. So it's a range, but I would say on average, it's probably 18, 20%. 20%. So I say that I'm the kind of idealist, and my business partner, who is just on the back of the house stuff, she would probably scold me and tell me that in reality, it's actually probably closer to like 23 or 24%. And so I should get my shit together. But anyways, that's kind of it.
I mean, that's actually a really good point that I hadn't thought of before just now. But when you're talking about kind of theoretical versus actual costing, and you know, you always like, if you never know, you know, if you do an infusion wrong on your whiskey or something, like that's going to affect your pour costs. Like, do you calculate it on both ends, or is it kind of just
no,
you have a target? And
so I'm of the opinion, you know, what Claire was saying about having daily cost meetings is nauseating to think about, not just in terms of how grinding it must be as an individual person working at this place, but as a business owner, I cannot imagine trying to be that granular, because there's a point of diminishing return in analyzing cost. And so from my perspective, it's a little easier to have to look at my monthly financials and look at all of our expenses for the month, see where we are. And if there's something that sticks out, you know, if we spend a little bit more on produce because we had some infusions go wrong and spirit costs were a little high, if we had to spill out a couple bottles of whatever spirit because the infusion didn't go right or whatever, we can try and figure out how to fix that. But it's not worth analyzing at the time, or even, I think, for me personally, at any finer level of detail than a month or time frame than a month, to analyze those costs, because it's just, I think, a waste of time. The goal is for us is always to be as good as we can and as efficient as we can, knowing that we can't possibly control for everything and every nickel. And just, you know, it sounds very careless, and I promise you there's a better system than that. But it's you know, I don't know. It changes.
speaking of better systems, Donny, you literally wrote an app to help people with this. Can you maybe talk about like what are some of the things that you see kind of on a global sense of like what are the concerns for people's poor costs? Where do they get things wrong? You know, what's kind of what problem are you solving essentially?
Yeah, when I moved back to Rochester from New York after working at Booker and Dex, I learned a lot of Booker and Dex. I learned nothing about costing though, because the bartender, like every bartender is not trained to be a manager. You just end up a manager and you have to figure it out. So I came back here. God, and I'm not blaming you for that. It's not your problem. I'm not saying you didn't tell me something you should have. But I got to Cure, where I was hired here. This is basically why I moved to Rochester, was to work at this place that I still work at now 6.5 years later. And the manager quit. They were like, you want to be the manager? You show up every day and you're behind the bar all the time. Why don't you just do that? And I was like, great. But I didn't know anything about I just had been serving drinks for years and didn't really understand or even had a chance to think about what was going on behind the scenes. So when I began to order, I realized that there were different distributors, and that if you ordered different amounts, you were either, there was like a benefit to ordering a greater number of things, and even you were penalized for not ordering a certain number of things. And then I began to think that we order everything in the metric system, or in like these weird vacuous terms like half barrel or whatever. These things are full of ounces, but the ounces are not listed on any of them. So I looked up in the App Store the word pour cost, because that seemed a reasonable way to search for an app that would help me decipher some of this stuff. and it didn't exist. So I was like, I was looking for an RIT. RIT is a local tech school. I was looking for an RIT student who could just bang something out for $500 to $2,000. Just like get something in the app store, provide this thing. If I'm going to make it for my phone, I may as well make it for everybody else's. And it turned into this like huge project that I probably should have stopped working on a lot before I did, because the majority of the people probably stop at the first screen and don't really dig into the background workings. It's a longer story than anybody has time for and probably less interesting. The point of doing this was to acknowledge or make public the concept that there is a portion of your revenue that is eaten up by cost. And I had seen a few bars fail around here because they just didn't think about what it was costing them to get money. So it was costing you $7 to make your happy hour whistle pig old fashioned. I'm not allowed to say brands, whatever. If it's costing you $7 to put a drink in front of someone that you're charging $6 for because it's happy hour, you had better find a way to, if there's a pulley here and there's 2 strings, find that money somewhere else. And I don't think a lot of people who get into this industry because they're passionate and creative have the ability or desire to look into how to operate a spreadsheet or create one or use someone else's or just really anything. Opening a computer is a lot for a lot of people who are bartenders. They didn't get into this because they wanted to do that. So everybody has a phone and you can download the app and it's free and it's slider based. So you can't even input the wrong information. You can use it improperly. So I guess you can use anything improperly, but it's supposed to be so very simple to understand the concept that it provides a solution to the greatest number of people possible. And but over the course of making it though, of course, I got so good at using spreadsheets that now I give seminars about how to use spreadsheets. So like, it's not to say I don't need to use the app. It's still good for spot checking because, you don't always have a computer in front of you. But I have recently dug very deep into the world. And now I make into the world of costing. And I make the spreadsheet systems and data control sheets for all of our like 5 restaurants or whatever. So now this is a really big part of that's one of the biggest parts of my life is just figuring out how to get the greatest value for the people, for the least cost for the restaurant or bar, and mitigating that constant battle of how much would you like to pay for this thing that you do want, and how much are we willing to talk you into something that isn't already what you said, for the sake of lowering our costs and providing a product that we have chosen for you. It's always I don't know if I'm going off track here, but it is a constant moving target to get something reasonably priced to someone who doesn't know that they want it yet, or to get something to be priced properly that they're already going to ask for. Because the things that are in magazines, you're paying that the magazine ad is in the cost of the bottle. So we just don't have mostly anything that you would know if you're not you people. If everybody who just like shows up to a bar, they would look at the back bar and go, like I would have done that 7 years ago if I looked at the back bar. I'd have no idea what any of it was. So we sort of like, we don't mean to do that, but we just chose a bunch of things that don't happen to be publicly, no one's aware of them already. And they're just kind of forced to trust us. Thereby, most of what we sell is what is in, not the house rail or whatever. And a lot of those are blends. You know how we make split base cocktails all the time? Like your Manhattan might be half one rye, half another rye, and 2 vermouths. We pre-combine everything. We have in the case, or by the case rather, in the basement, we have backups of rye blend, bourbon blend, Scotch blend, brandy blend. It's a way not only to bring costs down for us, but be able to add in our own, like we try to make archetypes of things. So while we could just choose the least expensive of the blend materials and just put that in the well, we like to look at it not as a cheapening something, but as us adding value to something by peppering it with like, I don't know, we have like a VS overproof Armagnac blended with a 42% alcohol non-age statement kind of like background noise Armagnac as our well brandy. So we could just put the background noise Armagnac in there, but we're putting in this $2.49 an ounce Armagnac in with it so that you get something that's a bit more of an archetype and really stands out in a sidecar or Bouquet or whatever it is that you're making with it. So we've had to find tons of tricks, and that path of like trying to figure out what pour cost was over those 6.5 years of basically just me being behind this bar. And it is almost only me. I'm the prep guy. I'm the full-time bartender. We always have like one other person, but it's kind of like whoever wants to be there for that year or whatever. I don't mean to sound jaded about that, but like stuff to keep them around, you know? So it has been me constantly whittling this one thing down into a thing that now looks like we are adding the value that you didn't know you wanted, and thereby reducing our costs in a variety of different ways. I could do this for 2 hours. I'm going to shut up and let you ask more questions.
Well, yeah, I think you're bringing the value add is a good segue to the second biggest chunk. I think that everybody has for cocktail costs is labor, and I think that especially in the case of a lot of kind of high concept bars, a lot of the value add is invisible to the guests, and also maybe done by tip workers or people who are working for minimum wage and may not be visible at all to the guest. And then out of sight, out of mind, I think a lot of people don't understand really the work that goes into making cocktails. So speaking of high prep, there's existing conditions is kind of the prime example for me. And I'm also curious to hear from everybody about labor costs, and especially I think, you know, this was written before the industry trying to open back up, such as it is, and now we're kind of faced with a lot of people having difficulty finding staff, as well as people maybe not struggling as much for whatever reason. And so maybe actually be clear, I'm curious to hear about you like operating a place in New York City that is kind of basically New York is more or less reopened, and maintaining or retraining, rehiring staff, and how that's been for you, and how maybe the gratuity-free model has affected that.
I'll say that we have like too much staff right now. So we're really lucky, but we you know, once we like went through the phases of hiring and interviewing and all that good stuff, we were able to staff up, and we've been able to maintain our staff. I think that goes a little bit hand in hand with the fact that we're so value driven, and we kind of wear that on our sleeve, and so people really identify with that, especially given the last year or so, and so people want to be a part of that. We also you know, we have to acknowledge with that, you know, our front of house is going to be making a little bit less than they would other places. I mean, that's the first thing I say when people email me about job, just so you know, this is how it'll be, but we do try to offer value in other ways, and that comes in the form of education and being part of like more community initiatives. And, you know, whether it's, you know, it could be raining or snowing that day, or you know, just completely dead, you'll always make the same amount of money every week. And I think people are really attracted to that. We even guarantee hours. So if everybody gets out, like has a quick close and they're out the door, you know, they still get the same amount of money for that shift. And so I think people are really, I've noticed that people are very attracted to like a more stable pay. But it, you know, like I mentioned earlier, it is a really kind of daunting and big task to take on, especially during a pandemic. And I, you know, John and you and I have had these conversations over the years, and I felt a very different way several years ago, because I was like, that's not sustainable for anybody. But I think in the last year, I felt that so much of our industry and so much of the smoke and mirrors around that was a barrier between what is going on actually in restaurants and what guests are seeing. I felt like some of that was dissipating. You saw that with the amount of GoFundMes for staffs that were launched at the start of shutdown and quarantine, and you see that in like the ongoing closures and the news of labor shortages and people not being paid X, Y, and Z. And so it felt like the right time to kind of just jump in head first for us and say, like, you know, and again, we have to really, as a restaurant bar that is doing that, and we have higher now we have higher costs of cocktails and higher costs of food, and we have higher risk. We have to be even more transparent when we have these conversations. We have to be more transparent as just existing in these spaces and saying like, this is what you make. This is why your sandwich costs this much money. And I personally am not scared to have those conversations with guests. Maybe it's because we operate more casually, we're at a lower price point, and that I do feel more comfortable, but I don't believe personally and professionally that we have to pretend that it's not challenging in this industry and do so at the expense of workers or ourselves as business owners. And, I talk about it all the time and, on social media and elsewhere. And when I'm really hungover, I love responding to the Yelp reviews. So I'm telling people exactly how much their food costs. But and it's really like, it's not these, when I'm even just the words I just said, those are like, sound like very non-tangible ideas, but like, if you believe in sustainable agriculture, if you believe like in equity, if you believe in, people being paid more and having living wages, then those things have to come at a cost. It has to come somewhere. Right. Doesn't come out of thin air. And I think I woke up this morning, I was thinking about the Venn diagrams of who carries the weight of all these things. Like, is it guests? Is it workers? Is it employees? And ultimately it has to come from, is it the quality or what we want to see on a plate as creators? Is it what we want to see in the glass as creators? Like, all of those things have to overlap and they all have to contribute to it. So that's also, that's how it kind of factors into making cocktails and menu choices for myself. Is like, okay, I'd love to have this item in a menu, dish or drink, but is that at a disservice to our other missions? And so, like anything, it's always a give and take and a compromise in some way.
Yeah, totally. It's like the theater of hospitality is about making it look easy, and the harder people work at making it look easy, the harder it is to do, and then the harder it is for people to see that value. So it's this kind of like, it's kind of this like twisted catch-22 of, if you look like you're struggling, people aren't really gonna be that favorable towards your bar or restaurant. But if you make it look easy, then people are just like, oh, well, why does this cost $50? It's just some figs on a plate. I'm curious, Pasha, like, you're based in Texas, and I think that there's part of core costs and cocktails is like kind of what people are going to pay, and cost of living and kind of all that. So I know that you are able to offer like benefits to your staff and other things that I was really impressed to see. So maybe just talking about your perspective of labor costs and
Sure.
how it factors in.
Bulk of my adult life has been in a different environment, in a sort of salaried environment where I and the people that I work with are considered in a traditional sense by a lot of the people that would be our guests as professionals. But because of that, my approach was that when I opened a bar, I wanted the people that came to work at the bar to be treated as professionals, both by me and not by every guest who comes in, obviously, but I wanted the institution, the bar itself, to treat them as professionals in the same way that I am treated as a professional by my boss at NASA, because quite frankly, that's what human beings deserve. I don't care what the job is. You're learning, you're doing something consistently. It is your job. That is your profession. You're a professional. So, and part of it also, and there's also, it's part of it is altruistic in a genuine sense. I joke with a lot of my guests that I'm not a good capitalist at all. I actually got drunk one night and I tried to explain the Marxist theory of surplus labor to one of my bartenders once. He actually got mad at me for some reason, which was weird. But anyways, so I have a sort of target for all our staff, which is that I want them to have some type of benefits. Health insurance is critical. I am old and I have a terrible falling apart body as I get into my 40s. And so like I wanted them to be protected physically. And I also know that the lack of healthcare is a source of staffing issues in this industry. And This industry treats a lot of this industry, not all of it, and enough people I think on this panel, but at the sort of more corporate end of the industry, people are treated as disposable. I didn't want that. I wanted to create a place where people can work for a long time, develop themselves professionally, work with the bar. We develop as, they become fixtures at the bar, which is good for our guests. It's good for everybody. We all have a comfortable place we come to work and whatever. All that comes with costs. You have to provide some type of benefits. The target that I have, to Claire's point about the tip-free model, which I think is brilliant, that level of consistency, for example, that she was talking about, that nobody should worry about making less than a certain amount of money just because it's raining outside. That's a huge point. And so for me, in my head, the goal was to identify a target, not a salary, because nobody's salaried here, but to view their yearly pay. And I wanted everybody to be making at least X amount of dollars, and so a combination of higher wages and the average. I basically looked at our over time, and it changes. I would look at our average tip, our average gratuity, and then I would make sure that the hourly wages they're getting is adjusted to reach a certain point, so that they're making at least high mid five figures in the Houston market, which is like roughly what, again, from my perspective at NASA, is like what an engineer or a scientist makes at NASA midway through their career or whatever. And it's a moving target. It changes. So like and on average that puts us at a labor cost of roughly 30%. It's up, it goes up or down, but at the beginning of the pandemic, we also have pooled responsibility. So I don't have like a dedicated juicer or a dedicated dishwasher. We just have sort of senior bartenders and apprentices, and we all kind of pitch in. It's like a zone defense. We all juice, we all clean, we all rotate our positions, and we have the shifts designed so that all the work that needs to get done gets done throughout the shift. We have a couple, an hour or 2 hours now dedicated to some prep, and then we kind of do stuff as the day goes on. Anyways, the pre-pandemic, I had 5 staff members, and then during the pandemic, we were shut down for several months. We switched to to-go only. We started doing we became like a juice bar, and because of that, there weren't as many hours to go around. So we jacked up everybody's hourly by about 500% to make sure they were still making about the same amount of money. Because again, as Claire said, nobody should stress that they can't pay their bills just because something external changed that they can't control. Then as we opened back up in September, we had to double our staff, so our labor costs increased significantly because we switched to a service-only model, or a table service model. We used to be bar service, because in a post-COVID era, or in a COVID era, we wanted to keep people in their seats. We didn't want people milling around and spreading their germs, so we increased staff and then made adjustments accordingly. So it's the benefit for us is that we had the luxury of expanding into our parking lot to add capacity. So we doubled our staff, but we also doubled capacity. So luckily for us, we're able to keep our labor costs at roughly 30%. And then I guess the last thing I just want to add about labor is that, something I think Donny was saying earlier too, is that there's sort of an endpoint when you're designing a drink menu, and I mentioned this to you, John, when we talked for your piece, that there's only a certain amount of money that somebody's going to pay for a drink, and there's only a certain amount that somebody wants to engage with anything that you think is important. It's a lot of people, especially in my neighborhood, just want to come get a damn drink, and they want to pay no more than X amount of dollars. And so that's cool. That's the world we live in. That's the reality. And at the same time, I'm always going to have a fixed labor cost, roughly speaking, because there's certain standards that I want from my staff. And so everything else is kind of what you have to figure out in the middle. You can only charge so much for a drink, and you have to guarantee at least this much money for your staff. So do creative batching, like Donny was saying, figure out a way to use handles of something to come up with an infusion so that you can pour out of a small bottle. But in Texas, the liquor laws are very unique. So if you want to handle something and pour it from a smaller bottle, you got to infuse it, or whatever. So figure out creative ways to manage the massage, or to pull the levers, like what Donny was saying, all the other non-essential costs. Because for me, the only essentials are labor, some type of booze, whatever we don't have to change it depending on the situation, and then rent and all that other stuff. Anyways, I feel like I was rambling. I'm sorry. I'll stop.
No, not at all. You brought up a good point about I want to talk about what reasonable pricing is, and then also overall menu pricing, which is something I think about a lot. But before that, and you kind of broke it down, Pasha, with like there's labor, there's ingredients, there's probably rent, is a big one. And then in my piece, the next to taxes, which is around 10%, credit card fees 3%, I kind of created this like everything else bucket, which is around 20-25%. And so I'm curious, I think probably most people watching this have a sense of what this answer is, but I'm curious to hear from everybody kind of like what to them, what is like the most kind of surprising cost that's within that everything percent that maybe a lot of guests or even like kind of enthusiasts may not think about. AKA putting you on the spot because we're not needed.
Yeah.
You're like you're ready to talk.
Yeah, I was like, oh, I have so much to say, Yeah, I mean, there's a couple of different ways you could go. I mean, you could say, what are the unexpected costs? And it's like when your cold draft machine breaks, what it costs for a technician, what it costs when, there's all these sort of like things of business. But something that I thought about since we actually spoke for the Punch article was like, I really think that labor is the thing that people undervalue the most. I mean, out of so many different industries, you look outside of the food and beverage industry, they can, to a certain extent, limit the amount of labor that they're using and still operate. I just rented a car, and like they cut down on people working the counters and the amount of cars available, and the waits were longer, but it was this need and people just did it and they paid more. And restaurants and bars they cannot operate without people. And I had like a line that I thought about since we spoke, and it was like, if I'm going to a baseball game, I know I'm going to buy, a pint of Budweiser and it's going to cost me like $20. And I accept that because I'm at a baseball game and the cost of the location and the experience and all this is more. And that's like a very widely accepted thing. If I'm in a hotel and I buy a glass of champagne, it's going to cost more than if I go to my local restaurant and I buy a glass of champagne. So if that is acceptable, that as one item can cost different in multiple places based on the venue, then why is it not acceptable for people to understand that a business that is compensating its staff, things will cost more, And so it's like every sort of business cog that I've deep dived into, and all of all the places that I kind of consulted at over the last year, the big sort of like rock and the hard place was how much things are going to cost for guests. I worked at a place over the pandemic that I helped put a cocktail menu together for them, and they had such a huge problem keeping staff, and it was. The owner was trying to do something really equitable, and in certain places illegal, but illegal in a good way. I feel like in New York we have what's called the 80-20 law. So it's if you're 80% guest facing, you can accept tips, and if you're 20% or any less than that, so say front of house, back of house, you're not allowed to accept tips. They kind of reworked the system so that everyone was somewhat guest facing. So that they could split the tip pool with everybody. So anyone from the porter to the dishwasher to the front of house, everybody was in the tip pool. So the idea behind this was great, but nobody was making money because they were keeping everyone's hourly at like $10, $15. You have a tip pool that's, instead of being split between like a 5-person front of house team, like a 20-person total house team. And they also wanted to keep the prices of sandwiches and drinks and everything really, really cheap because they wanted to feel like a neighborhood spot that people weren't being gouged. And what I kind of came back to them is like, okay, well, what's a living wage in New York City? If your take-home paycheck is, I feel like $800, that's like comfortable. You could go lower, but then it starts getting really, really tight when you consider like average person is paying $1,400 a month, $1,400 a month in rent. So then if you really care about every person and staff making a livable wage, you have to take that cost and then your rent, you have to almost treat it as a fixed cost, and then your rent, like Pasha was saying, and you can be creative in terms of batching and how to rework ingredients. But I think at the end of the day, people just have to understand that the cost of running a restaurant and a bar involves people. And a lot of those people have been underpaid and undervalued. I think, John, we even spoke about, like, this is like real deep dive wormhole, but, like, where are your limes coming from? Where are your herbs coming from? I mean, we all saw, I think there was like a viral video of like farmers like picking radishes in like a forest fire in California, and they're making like 30 cents for, for every like 5 bushels that they make or something like that. It's the whole food operating system. I think the more of us that kind of come together and advocate for our staff, the better it's going to translate to guests, understanding like what the cost of actually running a restaurant is in terms of people. So I don't know. That's my.
Here.
I'm
Yeah,
sure. I'm sure that there's like a million things that cost that people don't think about. But that's my spiel.
Wonderful. Thank you. How about you, Donny? What's like something that's like kind of maybe surprising or not something that people immediately go to when they think of the $15 margarita? What the costs are?
I mean, that is a really tough question. I mean, the toilet breaks and we have to fix it, and the floors need to be refinished, and the chairs break, and we need new tables, and the place has to be painted. We have a porter who cleans the place once in a while. It's everything that, like you said, or someone said earlier, if you're doing I think it was you, John, if you're doing a really great job, it looks easy. And that means you have to pay people to do all this stuff. So not just people, but like the things that we need to do the things that need to be done. And the ice machine is always broken, and the CO2 always needs to be refilled, and the ball lock caps, AK, about this from existing condition. Running a carbonated beverage program is like really difficult if you're doing it the right way, keeping things down at a reasonable temperature for carbonation. John, you remember this stuff too. At Cure, we have mitigated a lot of these costs by not buying temperature adjustable, like the Randell FX store freezer that we had for carbonated drinks. That cost, that would have been $5,000 for one of those things. It was bananas, and it never worked properly. We just bought 4 dorm freezers and a floor standing freezer and installed digital temperature controllers on them. So we have a total of about 170 liters of pre-carbonated, backstocked carbonated beverages, all with carbo caps on them, in a floor standing and 4 dorm freezers, and a bunch of backed up in the walk-in. So I would guess like bottles, caps for carbonated drinks, freezers for those carbonated drinks, the insane amount of prep time that it takes to put the carbonated drinks into the carbonated drink containers. That at Cure is a lot of the unforeseen costs, I guess. And then paying someone, which is just me because I'm the prep guy and I'm salaried, so lucky them, right? To put all of the boozes that we use as our like archetypal spirits blends into those bottles. We could do this once a week for an hour, I bet, and still never get to the end of this, even just this conversation. I don't have one answer. I can just talk for hours about
it's
it.
A lot.
Glassware. I feel like people always forget glassware, but
glassware.
Yeah, glassware. Right.
Like, you go to a place and it's like, oh, well, why doesn't my drink look pretty? Because it's not in like a fancy coupe, but it's like, how much does that coupe cost, and how much, how many cases of them break, and I don't. all the stupid little things, that add the perceptive value to the cocktail.
Totally.
Yeah.
Pasha, what about you? What's something that's like not obvious?
I mean, it's all over the board. I think labor is the most underappreciated cost for people. I think you hear, there's a lot of people, and especially, most of my staff have been with me since almost we opened 5 years ago. So people begin to appreciate them as human beings the longer they see them in the same place, the longer they are in their lives. But you still get like the weekend warriors who come out and treat bartenders like crap, and they'll make demeaning comments like, "Whoa, what, do you get a real job?" and all this garbage. So I think in that sense, labor is the most underappreciated cost or misunderstood by guests. But then it's just equipment, COVID. Like I wanted to keep people safe, so we built a patio to save money. We built it ourselves, and then it's Houston, so it gets cold, which means like below 60 degrees. And now I got to go to Costco and buy 20 heaters and 40 gas propane tanks, and I had to keep those outside. They're pieces of garbage, so they only last a season. And so we probably spent $10,000 just to keep people a little bit warmer than they would have been otherwise. These are costs that pile up. There's a never-ending parade of costs, and it relates. There's something else that I wanted to mention, because I forgot to mention to you during our talk before, but it's very, I know all of us experience the profound and complex costs of running a bar, trying to treat our staff as professionals and as well as we can, and make sure everybody's comfortable and living a good life. And then to translate that into a good experience for our guests. We want everybody to be happy. That's our goal in this industry, as I understand it, is to maximize happiness. It can be challenging though, when sometimes guests, because I know a lot of guests assume that you make a lot of money in this industry. And there's one example in Houston, I'm not going to name any names, but I saw somebody, I will not be profane, complaining very vocally, very ostentatiously on Instagram about how hard this pandemic was and how all these sacrifices had to be made and all these employees were being furloughed. And then I saw this person in a $250,000 sports car later that month. And I think that there are certain people in this industry that have ostentatious wealth, and it's very trendy for us to, and I agree with Uncle Bernie, I think it's very trendy for us to look at people who essentially exploit an industry to make unseemly amounts of wealth, extracting wealth basically from the labor that they have. And it's easy for us to say that about Jeff Bezos, for example, but it's very hard people have to reconcile the fact that some people in this industry are exploiting it and making a lot of money. And when they're very visible, it's very hard for sometimes our guests, especially for small local bars, to realize that those are hopefully exceptions. And that these little local bars don't have that same luxury. We're not doing the same thing. We are not strip mining human beings for the sake of making drinks and making a lot of money. And so anytime I see somebody doing, I see somebody post a bar owner post a Porsche on Instagram or whatever, that pisses me off because it undermines everything that we are trying to do. Sorry, I will stop. Forgive me.
No, thank you. I think strip mining humans is like kind of a depressing soundbite, but I think that it describes a lot of what happens in our industry and probably in the world as a whole. But
historically,
yes. Claire, I wanted to give you a chance to, I feel like we're all sort of on the same page in terms of like the most kind of unexpected costs of running a cocktail program. But do you have anything to add?
When I think about the hidden cost of a bar, I think about the $20,000 I just spent fixing our HVAC system this month in the hottest month, when I really didn't have the money to do it. But I think about insurance is one of the things that always surprises me, because you have to pay it like in a bulk or even a bulk and then broken out. So it's like, oh, here's a $25,000 bill in January, which is our annual when we opened in the last month of the year. I want to actually pay something like that. But at the end of the day, those are like small percentages. And so I just think back about, like it's a nickel and dime industry on both sides, right? We're kind of getting nickel and dimed by all these costs, like whether it's the internet or credit card fees or paying $1,000 a month for trash pickup. I have to pay to get rid of my trash, and then we're kind of nickel and diming guests on the other side. And I think it's, as much as I talk about even being transparent with our guests, like when you order at our on our menu, it says right next to that, like, what you pay is what you see, and the cost of your food includes paying our staff higher wages, living wages, and it pays for using local farms and ingredients that we believe in and supporting queer Indigenous communities that are working in the food system. And I got a review once that was like, oh, I love Hunky Dory. They pay their staff well. They use all these cool farms, blah, blah, blah. But $20 for a sandwich is too much money. And I was like, well, you can literally identify like see the connections, but you still, and I'm guilty of it too, you know, sometimes when I'm drunk on the Lower East Side, I'm like, pizza costs more than 99 cents, get out of here. But the fact that I started bartending, I started making cocktails actually in Houston. And people were paying $12 for cocktails 13 years ago. And I moved to San Francisco and people were paying $12 to $15 for cocktails. And I just got back from San Francisco and people are still paying that much for cocktails 10 years later. And all these costs are rising, all these things are rising, and we're going through all this stuff like COVID, and everybody still wants to pay the same amount for food and drink. And then also be in the streets screaming about equity. And so again, it's like, when I think about that Venn diagram I mentioned about who is shouldering the costs, I think that the guest facing side really needs to be coming more to the table, and that includes myself. So, and it's putting more money into the people that are actually spending money in our communities too. It all goes hand in hand with making our industry more sustainable. It's not about putting more money in the people that are going up in spaceships into the air. No offense to my Clear Lake friend, but
I feel you.
I feel like it's also like when I was a kid, we'd like as a family, we'd go out to dinner like once, and that was like a big thing. And it's like the culture around even like going out drinking or going out to restaurants has changed. Now it's like, no, it's weird if you cook at home, but realistically, if food at restaurants cost, in some kind of like actual equitable, sustainable, model, it'd be so expensive, people wouldn't do it 7 days a week, or something like that. So it's like, we still expect going out to be as cheap as cooking at home, but obviously it's like that
Something's gotta give.
Changed. Yeah, I don't know if I said that right, but yeah.
We are at time, and obviously we could probably go on for another like 5 hours. Maybe we'll do a part 2 soon, but thank you so much, all of you, for such a engaging discussion and helping us shed some light on where things are now and kind of where things need to be in order for us to have like a healthy industry for many years to come, and to be able to support all the wonderful people that work in it, you all included, obviously. So thank you again. thanks everyone watching at home or wherever you are watching us. Thanks for joining, and have a good one.